The offerings at the local bookstore include any number of Bible story books for children. At the Borders near the college, several dozen Bible story books are available, including titles like the Eager Reader Bible, the Usborne Children's Bible, the Beginner's Bible, the Bible for Children, the Kingfisher Children's Bible, and the Everything Bible Stories book. Many familiar stories are included in these, from the Adam and Eve story to Noah and his ark to King David's encounter of Goliath. But what is not included is dramatic. For instance, the Eager Reader and Beginner's Bible versions of the Garden of Eden never note that Adam and Eve were naked, or that God's pronouncement to Eve included that she would desire her husband. The Beginner's Bible's David and Goliath story never mentions that Goliath actually died. It seems that the authors and editors of these retellings thought the actual stories to be too harsh for children. Are we doing anyone a service by cleaning up the sex and violence? It would be hard to tell the story of Bill Clinton's presidency without mentioning his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. And we can't accurately describe the George W. Bush presidency without including the horror of 9/11. The fact is, filtering the stories often, if not always, alters the original book's world. David is not simply a great king who established the holy city as a capital. He is a flawed figure, brought low by his own hubris. Like Bill Clinton, he had it all, but he tried to take more, and permanently stained his reputation. Context is critical. Change that, and we change the direction of a whole narrative. The Bible is a narrative of earthiness, sometimes blatant vulgarity, although most of the really vulgar Hebrew words and ideas in the book are nicely corrected by well-meaning translators. God, the Bible asserts, moves in a world of sex, violence, and the Hebrew's equivalent of rock and roll. David was, after all, a musician. But truth be told, modern Christianity actually institutionalizes the loss of context. Sunday in, Sunday out, Christians include readings from the Bible in their worship services. In many Protestant traditions, the readings are random, chosen by the preacher to fit a sermon theme he or she has planned for the week. The Roman Catholic and several other Protestant traditions make an effort to minimize the randomness through the structure of the lectionary. There are varying lectionaries, but the most common is the 3-year lectionary used by Catholics, many Lutherans, Episcopalians, and some Methodist and Presbyterian groups. Every Sunday is assigned a reading from the Gospels, from the Old Testament, and from the letters of the New Testament, which includes the Acts of the Apostles and the Revelation as well. After 3 years, the cycle is repeated. As much as this holds more hope of creating context than complete randomness, there are several problems. First, the simple fact is that the whole Bible is not included. Reality is, there are several biblical books that never, absolutely never, are included in these churches' Sunday worship, from 1st and 2nd Chronicles to Ezra to Obadiah and Nahum. Many books, like Nehemiah and the Song of Solomon, are represented by just one very short reading. Second, even those books that are well represented, like the Gospels, have significant pieces that are not included. For instance, one could go to church every Sunday for years and never hear Matthew's account of Jesus' famous, "You have heard it said, you shall not kill, but I say to you, whoever is angry with a brother or a sister is liable to judgment." In the same way, the line, "He who lusts for a woman has already committed adultery in his heart," is nowhere to be found in the 3-year cycle. And third, what pieces are included are not necessarily given to the worshiper in order. This is being recorded just after the season of Lent is completed. Over the 5 Sundays of Lent, the lectionary had scheduled Luke 4, the last part of Luke 13, then the first part of Luke 13, then Luke 15, followed by John 12. One can hardly get the flow of a story by listening to the pieces in random order. Ironically, Luke's expressed intent was, quote, "to write an orderly account," end quote. The lectionary has undone what Luke works so hard to do. We can argue that the whole church community is being given a children's Bible. The lectionary never schedules the stories of Judah and Tamar, Jephthah's daughter, Amnon's sex with his sister, the murder of Eglon in his bathroom, the sex between Lot and his daughters, and many, many more of the Bible's earthy elements. How can anyone know the Bible's real intent if they never hear all the pieces, and they never hear them in order?
The Bible shocks American sensitivities. As brazen as we are in our movies, TV, music, and even our personal lives, we simply can't seem to accept that the major scripture of Western religion is chock full of nudity, deceit, seduction, adultery, and incest. Take the story of Ruth, for instance. She's portrayed as such a nice girl. She's quoted at thousands of weddings every year. Wherever you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. That's read on a Sunday in the second year of the cycle as well. The next Sunday, the story is concluded, the first 5 verses of chapter 3 and verses 13 to 17 of chapter 4. But it's what's between those 2 weeks, the verses that no one ever hears in church, that makes Ruth most memorable. Ruth is a Moabite. She comes from Moab, the country across the Jordan River. Her husband, Naomi's son, has died, as has Naomi's own husband. The book opens with Naomi's decision to return to Israel, to what is left of her own Hebrew family. Ruth, with nothing to hold her in Moab, decides to go with her. Once in Bethlehem, the women settle into the poverty of women without men. But the story takes a turn when Naomi notices that her distant relative Boaz has taken some interest in Ruth's well-being. Naomi dresses Ruth up and sends Ruth to where the men are eating and drinking. Unaware that he's being watched, Boaz has enough to drink that he is in a, quote, contented mood, end quote, and he doesn't make it all the way home. He falls asleep on the threshing floor. It's there while he's asleep that Ruth joins him and, quote, uncovers his feet, end quote. That phrase is not about his shoes and socks. It is a biblical euphemism, building on the Hebrew use of feet to represent male genitals. It is in this vein that the men of Sodom invite the strangers to wash their feet. And Zipporah saves Moses by touching a bloody foreskin to Moses' feet. And King David tells Uriah to go home and, quote, wash his feet, end quote. This is also what's meant when the cherubim in Ezekiel's vision are said to use 2 wings to cover their feet. Uncovering Boaz's feet is meaningless if it is literally feet, but it means everything if Ruth just had sex with him. The story gets comical when, at midnight, Boaz wakes up, rolls over, and is startled at her presence. We seem to be told that he slept through their first encounter, but it's too late. According to Hebrew culture, she is now his wife. Ruth simply asks to be rolled into his cloak for the night, and she lay at his feet until morning. If the euphemism holds, it was a long night of lovemaking. Ruth is not a book about woman as victim. She decides what she wants, takes it, and her great-grandson will, as a result, be the greatest king of Israel's history.
Still, Ruth is nothing like Tamar. In the story of Joseph that stretches from Genesis 37 to 50, there is one interruption. Chapter 38 shifts the focus to Joseph's brother, Judah. Judah, we are told, had a son who married Tamar. Tamar's husband did something, and we don't know what, that made God so angry that God smote him. Actually, the word smote is mine. The word used is killed. But Tamar had no child to depend on in her old age, so she turned to Judah. In accordance with the law of Israel, Judah's second son, Onan, married Tamar, the idea being that this marriage was simply an arrangement to get Tamar a son. However, Onan, quote, spilled his seed, end quote, the Bible's words, not mine. And that apparently was enough to get him smote as well. Still childless, Tamar turned back to Judah. But Judah, perhaps a little wary of all the smoting, sent her away to her father's house with the promise to call her when the third and last son was older. The call never came. Time passed, and Judah's own wife died. After mourning appropriately, Judah went to see his sheep shearers in Tamar's home area. Tamar caught word of the visit and dressed up like a zonah, the Hebrew word for a common prostitute. Upon seeing her sitting on the side of the road, Judah negotiated an encounter, but with no cash in hand, actually the price was a goat kid, he left his signet ring and staff as collateral until he could send someone back with that kid. We're left to wonder how he could not know that the woman was his daughter-in-law. When Judah sent his friend with the kid, the friend asked around for the kodeshah, literally a holy woman, but the word used for sacred prostitutes. Of course, none could be found, so the friend returned with the kid and no signet ring or staff. Time passed, and the story continued with Tamar being dragged before Judah. He was told that his daughter-in-law had played the whore, and as a result was pregnant. Judah commanded that she be burnt. It's only outside, as she was being dragged away, that Tamar told her would-be executioners that she had the ring and staff of her lover. Shown the ring and staff, Judah responded, "She is more righteous than I." The critical question, of course, is this: how did the accusers find out that Tamar had played the whore? There are only two people who could have been privy to that info, and one, Judah, didn't seem to know. That means that Tamar was the one who told. The inescapable conclusion is that she let the detail out knowing full well where it would lead. She did, after all, come to an execution with the ring and staff in her possession. In the end, she got revenge on her father-in-law and a set of twins.
There's another Tamar in the Bible, and her story is even more shocking. When this story begins, David is the king of a united Israel. His own sexual misplay with Bathsheba has just concluded with the death of Bathsheba's baby, but the ensuing birth of Solomon to David and Bathsheba. David had a daughter named Tamar and a son named Amnon. No mention is made of their mother or mothers, so we have no idea whether they're full siblings or half-siblings. Amnon ached to be with Tamar. A friend of his uncle helped him come up with a scheme. Amnon pretended to be sick and asked his father to send his sister to cook for him. Tamar came to his quarters and kneaded cakes, quote, in his sight, end quote. In other words, Amnon got to watch her wiggle. At last, he asked her to his sleeping room, where he asked her to lie with him. Her response was incredible. "Don't force me to do this. Such a thing is not done in Israel. But speak to the king, and he will not withhold me from you." Whether they are full or only half-siblings, the law of Moses clearly prohibits that they be together. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's daughter, according to Leviticus 18. So what was Tamar trying to accomplish with that statement? On the one hand, she may simply have been naive. On the other, she may simply have been buying some time. Faced with Amnon's pressure, she might have hoped to escape by ploy. But on the other hand, and yes, three hands are always a problem, she may actually have thought that her father would indeed allow that relationship. After all, just verses before, he slept with another man's wife and murdered him to cover it up. Is this a statement about how the character of the nation of Israel has so quickly deteriorated? In the space of the next 70 verses, David's son, Amnon, will rape his sister. Another son, Absalom, will murder his brother, and his father will forgive that murder, allowing Absalom to initiate a revolution against his father's crown, culminating in Absalom's very public orgy with his father's wives. The Bible is indeed full of shocking sexual tales, but perhaps none is as shocking as the one that closes Noah's story. After a year on an ark with all those animals, and remember that the ark was not a boat, but a box with no top deck and only one window, Noah's nerves were understandably frazzled. Immediately upon disembarking, he planted the first vineyard, perhaps the first of all history, but certainly the first in the post-flood era. The very next sentence says that he drank some of the wine and became drunk. He passed out with his robe no longer concealing his nakedness. Ham, his son, quote, looked on the nakedness of his father, end quote. Now, do you remember the commandment in Leviticus about sister and brother? That same euphemism was used there to mean have sex with. You need only let your imagination plunge into the darkest sexual behavior imaginable to know why Noah was so angry in the morning. Lest you think Ham's behavior was innocent, Noah's next day anger should be a clue. Noah would not have been aware the next morning that he was looked at, yet he was livid. He felt the aftermath of what had happened. For this, Ham's descendants, those Canaanites who celebrated life so easily through sexual activity, received the heat of Noah's angry curse. By the way, Ham's name is the Hebrew word for hot, and the Hebrew word is used as the equivalent of horny.
How far can we go? The stories seem endless. Sodom is destroyed after the men demanded that 2 messengers from God be brought out so that they might, quote, know them. In the next chapter, Lot's daughters, fearing there were no men left in the world, got their father drunk on 2 consecutive nights so that they might sleep with him and have his children. Samson spent his entire career as the judge of Israel, sleeping with the women of the enemy. Yael murdered the enemy general Sisera after what may well have been sex for the cause. David had sex with the wife of one of his best warriors and then murdered him to cover it up, and the whole thing may have been a ruse created by Bathsheba herself, and the baby someone else's, not David's at all. Esther saved her people by means of what many believe was a royal lap dance. And of course, the Song of Solomon quotes a young man saying to a young woman, "Your stature is like that of the palm. Your breasts are like clusters of fruit. I said, I will climb the palm tree. I will take hold of its fruit. May your breasts be like the clusters of the vine." 4 times prophets express the anger of God with the Hebrew equivalent of the F word, shagal, such as in Jeremiah 3:1-2, where the prophet says, "You have played the whore with many lovers. Where have you not been shagaled?" Eve herself, with Adam beside her, seems to open human eyes to sex. But God's so-called punishment of Eve hardly seems to fight that. In the midst of your anxiety, God says, I will multiply your conceptions, and your lust will be for your husband. He will have power over you. That last part presumably makes reference to the male's power to seduce. The result? God says, now they're just like we are. And Adam says, I will call you Chava, which means life, because you are the mother of life. When we leave out the coarse and the earthy, we make God out to be above it all, rather than in the midst. Ham, Abraham, Judah, David, and all the rest are, from our vantage point, often seedy characters. But these are God's people, not simply as a nation and as a lineage, but as his friends, his homies. Maybe the message in all of this is that God likes our earthiness.